The wolf named Grey did not move when Mara knelt beside him. He lay on his side in the straw, his chest rising and falling too fast, his golden eyes fixed on nothing. She pressed the back of her hand gently against his neck. The heat coming off him was alarming. She had felt fevers like this before, but only in animals that were days from dying, and she was not going to let that happen. She had not been invited here. That was the part that mattered most. 3 days ago, she had heard in the village market that 6 wolves inside the royal stables had fallen sick. People said the king's healers were trying everything. People also said the wolves were still getting worse. Mara had stood at the bread stall listening to the gossip and felt something pull tight in her chest the way it always did when an animal was suffering and nobody knew the right thing to do. She had gone home, packed her satchel, and walked the 4 miles to the palace gates. The guards had not taken her seriously at first. She was not tall or imposing. She wore a plain grey cloak and carried a canvas bag that smelled like dried herbs and river clay. She told the first guard her name was Mara Lane, that she was from the village of Aldwick, and that she had spent the past 6 years caring for injured and sick wolves in the valley lowlands. The guard had looked at her the way people always looked at her when she introduced herself, like he was trying to figure out if she was joking. She was not joking. She had asked to speak to whoever was in charge of the stables. The guard had said she could leave her name and the household would consider it. She had told him, politely but firmly, that she would wait. She sat on the stone step outside the gate for 2 hours while the afternoon sun moved across the sky, and she did not leave, and eventually a stable hand named Oliver had come out and looked at her with something between curiosity and exhaustion and said, "Fine, come in, you can try." That had been yesterday. She had spent the rest of the first day simply observing. She moved slowly between the 6 wolves without trying to touch them or treat them. She watched their breathing, noted which ones were eating and which ones were not, checked the color of their gums, watched how they responded to sound and light. She did not write anything down because she had never needed to. Her mother had taught her that the body of a sick animal tells a story if you are patient enough to listen to it. By the end of that first evening, she had a clear picture of what she was dealing with. This was not the random sickness people had assumed. It had a pattern. The fever, the shallow breathing, the refusal to eat, the way they kept their heads low and their ears pressed flat, it was a specific kind of infection she had seen 3 years ago in the Valley Park, one that spread in wet conditions through contaminated water or feed. It was serious, but it was treatable if you moved quickly and used the right things. She had told Oliver what she needed. He had looked at her list of herbs and roots and said he would have to get approval before spending the household's money on anything. She had nodded and said she understood, and then she had opened her own satchel and pulled out what she had brought from home and gotten to work. She worked through the night. By the time the stable doors let in the first pale light of morning, Gray's breathing had slowed slightly. Not much, but enough to matter. The silver female in the far corner, the one Mara had privately named Usher because she needed to call them something in her head, had lifted her head twice and sniffed at the air. That was the first time she had done anything other than lie still. Mara sat back on her heels, pressed her palms into the small of her back, and exhaled. Oliver arrived at sunrise with 2 stable hands and found her still there on the floor. He stared. "You slept here." "I did not sleep much," she said honestly. "But yes." He said the household had approved her supply list and the items would arrive by mid-morning. He also said there were empty guest quarters in the east wing and she was welcome to them. She thanked him and said she would take a room to wash up and change, but she would be returning to the stables after that. Oliver looked at the wolves, then back at her. "You think staying close to them helps?" "I know it does," she said. "They need to learn that a person can be in their space without being a threat. If they trust me, they will let me treat them. If they do not trust me, they will fight the treatment even when it is working." He seemed to think about that. Then he nodded slowly and said he would have a cot brought in. It arrived that afternoon, a narrow wooden frame with a thin mattress and 2 wool blankets. Mara set it up in the corner between Gray's stall and Usher's, folded her cloak at the foot of it, and went back to work. Nobody from the royal household came to check on her that day. Nobody came the day after either. The palace operated like a city within itself, and one quiet woman in the stables was apparently not urgent enough to draw attention from anyone above the rank of stable hand. Mora was fine with that. She had not come here to be noticed. She had come because Gray and Usher and 4 other wolves were sick and getting sicker, and nobody else had figured out what was wrong with them. She focused on the work. She prepared infusions of dried elderflower and white willow bark and pressed them into the feed she had asked Oliver to modify, softer cuts mixed with warm broth, easier to eat when the throat was inflamed. She cleaned wounds where the skin had cracked from the fever. She changed the straw in each stall twice a day to reduce the chance of the infection spreading through contact. She stayed up past midnight and rose before sunrise, and the hours in between were mostly sleepless anyway because she listened for changes in breathing the way some people listen for rainfall. On the 4th morning she was awake before dawn, sitting with Usher's large silver head resting across her legs, reading by the light of a small lamp she had set on the floor beside her. The book was nothing important, a worn collection of plant illustrations her mother had given her years ago. She was not really reading it. She was watching Usher breathe, and the book was just something to hold. She heard the stable door open. The sound was quiet. Careful. Not the way Oliver moved, who always came in quickly and let the door bang behind him. This was someone who was paying attention to the noise they made. Mora looked up. The man standing in the doorway was not dressed like a king. That was the first thing she registered. He wore a dark coat, plain and well-fitted, no decoration, no insignia she could see from across the stable. He was tall with dark hair and a face that was, at this particular moment, entirely unreadable. He looked at the wolves. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at her again, differently, like he was adjusting to something he had not expected. She did not stand up. Usher was settled and any sudden movement would disturb her. Instead, Mora held still and waited to see what he would do. He stepped inside and let the door close softly behind him. He moved slowly, the way you move around animals you respect, which told her something. He stopped about 6 feet from Usher's stall and looked down at the wolf, and something passed across his face that Mora could not name exactly. It was not sadness and it was not relief. It was something older than both. She ate last night, Mora said. Her voice was low, calibrated not to disturb Usher. Not much. But she finished the broth. He looked at her. You were here last night. I am here every night. A pause. The guest quarters were offered to you. Yes. I use them to wash and change. I sleep here. She glanced down at Usher, then back up at him. The first 3 nights of treatment are the most important. They needed someone present. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, what is wrong with them? So she told him. She explained the infection plainly, what caused it, how it moved through a pack, why the royal healers had not identified it correctly, what she was using to treat it and why. She spoke the way she always spoke about these things, directly and without unnecessary words, because the subject mattered too much to dress up in complicated language. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for another moment. Then he said, you came here on your own. No one sent for you. No. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because they were sick and no one was fixing it. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely there, but she caught it. He looked back at Usher. The silver wolf's ear twitched but she did not lift her head. He stayed for perhaps 40 minutes. He asked about each wolf by name, and she answered each question carefully and completely. Before he left, he stood at the stable door for a moment with his hand on the frame, and he looked back at her sitting on the floor in the straw with a wolf asleep across her legs and a lamp burning low beside a warm book, and he said nothing more, and then he was gone. It was only after the door had been closed for a full minute that Oliver appeared from the back of the stable where he had apparently been quietly working this entire time, and said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual, that was the king. Mora looked at the door. Then she looked back at Usher. I know, she said. Oliver waited, clearly expecting something more. She reached down and adjusted the edge of the blanket that had fallen from her cot. Gray needs his morning compress in about an hour, she said. Can you make sure the water is warm this time? Yesterday it was too cold and he pulled away from it. Oliver stared at her for another second. Then he went to heat the water. Mara turned back to her book and to Usher's steady breathing and to the slow, careful work of bringing 6 wolves back from the edge of something very bad. The king's visit was a fact she had noted, the same way she noted changes in temperature or breathing patterns. It was information. It would be processed in its proper place after the work was done. There was always more work to be done first. The second wolf to stand on all 4 legs was the one Oliver called Storm, a dark-coated male who had been the sickest of the group when Mara first arrived. She had spent more time on him than on any of the others, not because the others mattered less, but because Storm had required more convincing. He did not trust people easily even when healthy, according to Oliver, and the sickness had made that distrust sharper and more present. He had snapped at the royal healer who tried to examine him 4 days before Mara arrived. He had refused to eat from anyone's hand. He had not snapped at Mara. She had spent the better part of 2 hours on her second day simply sitting outside Storm's store, not moving toward him, not reaching toward him, just being there and being still. She had talked to him quietly the whole time, not baby talk or pleading, just ordinary words in an ordinary tone, describing what she was doing and why, the same way she would explain herself to a skeptical person. It had seemed strange to Oliver, who had come by twice and watched for a few minutes without comment. But by the end of the second hour, Storm had stopped tracking her every movement with that tight, suspicious focus and had put his head down. That was the beginning of trust. It always started like that. The moment an animal stopped treating you like a threat was the moment you could actually help them. By day 5, Storm was letting her change his compress without pulling away. On day 6, he ate a full portion. The morning he stood up, Mara was refilling the water bowl in Usher's stall and did not see it happen. She heard Oliver make a sharp sound from across the stable, not alarm, something closer to surprise. She turned. Storm was standing, slightly unsteady, his legs trembling with the effort, but standing. His dark eyes found her across the room. She did not make a big thing of it. She set down the water bucket, walked over to his stall, and crouched down so she was at his eye level. Good, she said quietly. That is very good. He sniffed the air in her direction. Then he lowered himself back down into the straw, slowly and with some difficulty, but controlled. He was not collapsing. He was choosing to rest. Mara sat back against the wall outside his stall and let herself feel, for a few seconds, the particular kind of relief that comes from watching something survive that might not have. It was in this moment that the stable door opened. She had started to recognize the sound of it, the careful way it moved on its hinges when it was him rather than Oliver or the stable hands. She looked up. Aldrich stopped when he saw Storm standing. Or saw Storm, who had now lain back down, but with a posture that was entirely different from the flat, barely there stillness of a week ago. He stood inside the door and looked at the wolf for a long moment. Then he said, without looking at Mara, he stood up. About 10 minutes ago, she said. Aldrich walked over, unhurried, and crouched outside Storm's store the same way she had. Storm looked at him. There was a long pause. Then the wolf put his head down and closed his eyes. Mara watched Aldrich's face. There was something there that she had glimpsed on the first morning but could see more clearly now, not just relief about the wolf, but something more personal than that. She did not ask about it. It was not her place and she did not need to understand everything about a situation to function inside it. He stayed crouched there for a while. Then he stood and moved to where she was sitting against the wall, and he sat down on the floor beside her, which she had not expected. The floor was covered in clean straw. He was wearing the same kind of plain, well-made coat he had worn on the first morning. She wondered briefly if the lack of obvious royal clothing was deliberate. How long before he can walk normally? Aldrich asked. Another week, maybe 10 days before I would call it normal. The muscles weaken during a fever like this. The body borrows from them to fight the infection, she paused. He will be fully himself again. It will just take some time. Aldrich looked at the far wall. The healer I had before you said Storm was too far gone to recover. The healer you had before me did not identify what was actually wrong, she said. Not unkindly, but directly. He glanced at her. What did they think it was? Something systemic. A general decline. They were treating symptoms without understanding the cause. She picked a piece of straw off her sleeve. It is a common mistake. When something looks severe, people sometimes stop looking for the source because they assume the source must be too complex to identify. But most things have a source. And you found it quickly. I found it on the first day, she said. I just needed time to confirm it before I said anything. She hesitated, then added, I have seen this specific infection before. 3 years ago, in the Valley Lowlands. A pack of 8 wolves. The same signs. I lost 2 of them before I understood what I was fighting. I was not going to lose any here. She had not planned to say that last part. It came out before she had thought about whether to share it. She expected him to respond with something formal, something about the importance of the pack to the kingdom. He said, I am sorry you lost 2. She looked at him. He was looking at the straw on the floor, not at her, which somehow made the words feel more genuine rather than less. She was not sure what to do with that, so she said nothing, and the silence sat between them without being uncomfortable, which was unusual in her experience. Silences with people she did not know well were usually uncomfortable. They sat there for a while as the stable settled into its morning sounds, the quiet movement of animals, the distant clatter of the household beginning its day. You never actually told me your name, he said eventually. Mora Lane. Where is Aldwick? South of the valley. Small. You would not have reason to know it. I know most of the villages in the territory. Then perhaps you know it as the place that produces river clay. There is a merchant who ships it north every spring. Something close to amusement moved across his face. Yes. I know it that way. Most people do. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a kind of deliberate ease that suggested he was choosing to ask rather than demand, why herbs and wolves? Of all the things. She thought about that. It was not a question she was asked often because most people in Aldwick had watched her grow up doing it and considered it simply a part of who she was, the way others were part of a farming family or a fishing family. My mother, she said finally. She was a healer. Not royal, not trained in any official way. Just someone who knew plants and paid attention. When I was very small, she brought a wolf pup into our house that had been separated from its pack and had a broken leg. I watched her set the leg and feed the pup and keep it alive through 2 weeks of bad weather. When the pup was well enough, she carried it back to where the pack ran and let it go. Mara paused. I asked her how she knew it would survive on its own again. She said she did not know for certain, but she had done everything she could, and after you have done everything you can, the rest belongs to the animal. She realized she was looking at her own hands. She looked up. Aldric was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. She sounds like a remarkable woman, he said. She was, Mara said. She died 4 years ago. I am sorry. Thank you. Another quiet stretch. Outside, a bird called twice and was silent. Gray moved his water bowl this morning, Mara said, bringing them back. He pushed it with his nose. It means he wanted it closer. A week ago he was not interested in water at all. She looked toward Gray's store. That is a significant change. Aldric followed her gaze. Gray was lying with his head up now, ears alert, tracking the sounds of the stable. A week ago those ears had been pressed flat with fever and discomfort. You talk about them like people, Aldric said. They have personalities, she said. Gray is stubborn and particular. Storm is cautious but loyal once he decides you are safe. Usher is perceptive, she notices things before the others do. She glanced at Aldric. You know this. You have had them longer than I have. Something changed in his face. Softer, briefly, then steady again. Yes, he said. I know. He left a short time after that. He had stayed nearly an hour, which Oliver later told her, in a hushed and slightly astonished voice, was longer than the king typically remained in any single room that was not a meeting hall. Moro did not know what to do with that information either. She filed it away in the same place she had filed the other things she did not yet know how to categorize: his expression when he saw Storm standing, the way he had said he was sorry about the 2 wolves she lost, the fact that he had sat on the stable floor in his good coat without appearing to think twice about it. She had work to do. She went back to it. 3 of the wolves were now eating consistently. 1 was moving around his stall with confidence. The remaining 2, including Gray, were improving steadily. The infection was losing. She could feel it in the way the stable itself felt different now, less tense, less held breath. Animals know when the danger in their space is receding, and the shift in them when it does is something you can sense even if you cannot describe it precisely. She was in the middle of preparing the evening compounds when Oliver appeared at her shoulder with an expression she had not seen on him before, somewhere between nervous and important. "The household has sent word," he said. "You are requested to join the king and his household council for dinner this evening." Moro looked at the bowl of elderflower in her hands. "What time?" "7th hour." She looked at the window. The sky was still pale gold. "I need to finish this and do the evening checks. I can be at the east wing by 6:30 if someone can tell me which room." Oliver blinked. He had clearly expected more of a reaction. "I will send someone to show you." "Thank you." He hovered. "It is a formal dinner," he said carefully. She looked down at her clothes, which were clean but plain, good wool trousers and a dark green tunic that had seen better days but was still respectable. "I did not bring formal clothes," she said. "I did not expect to be here this long. I could ask the household." "I will wear what I have," she said, not rudely but firmly. "If that is acceptable to the household, I will come. If it is not, they can send a note and I will eat here." Oliver stared at her for a moment longer, then pressed his lips together in the particular way she had come to recognize as him trying not to smile. He went to send word. She finished the compounds, completed the evening checks, confirmed that all 6 wolves were stable and settled, washed her hands and face in the basin near the back of the stable, and changed into the cleanest version of what she had, which was a dark blue tunic that was slightly better than the green one. Then she walked across the courtyard to the east wing to have dinner with the king. She was not nervous. She was not sure why she was not nervous, but she was not. She had spent the past week sitting on stable floors and sleeping in straw and doing the only work that mattered in this place, and a dining room with formal china seemed, by comparison, quite manageable. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was that he had asked for her to be included. The invitation had not come from the household council. It had come from Aldrich himself, quietly, at some point during the day, without explanation. The household had assumed they understood the reason. They were wrong about what the reason was, but that misunderstanding would take time to unravel, and the evening had not yet begun. She sat at the far end of a long table in a room lit by candles and a fire that was larger than her entire cottage back in Aldwych. There were 8 people at dinner. 2 were council members whose names she did not catch clearly enough to hold. One was a woman named Helen who was described as the household administrator and who had the efficient manner of someone who was very good at a great many things and had no patience for people who were not. One was a younger man named Callum who appeared to be some kind of advisor and who kept looking at her with an expression she could not interpret. And one was Aldrich, who sat at the head of the table and spoke comfortably to everyone around him and did not, from what Moro could observe, treat her any differently than he treated the others. She found this interesting. She had expected some version of the dynamic she encountered in the village when someone from outside the usual social order sat at a table where they were not usually expected. The slight overattention, the performative including, the subtle markers that communicated that everyone was being very generous. She had learned to recognize it and to sit through it without letting it make her feel small. She did not feel any of that here. Helen asked her direct questions about the treatment and listened to the answers with genuine attention. Callum asked how she had learned to distinguish this particular infection from the 3 other conditions that caused similar symptoms in wolves, which was an unexpectedly specific question and one she enjoyed answering. The council members were largely silent but not unfriendly. Aldrich asked her, at one point during the second course, how many wolves she had treated in total over the past 6 years. She had never counted. She thought about it for a moment and said, honestly, that she believed it was somewhere near 40, but she had never kept a formal record. Why not? Helen asked. The question was not critical, just curious. Because the number was never the point, Mara said. Each animal was the point. Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she said, yes, I imagine so, in a tone that was something close to approval. After dinner, when the others had drifted toward the sitting room for the kind of continued conversation that Mara associated with people who had no animals to check on at a specific hour, she excused herself quietly and made her way back across the courtyard to the stables. The night air was cold and clear. She could see stars between the breaks in the clouds. She walked without hurrying and thought about the dinner, cataloguing it the way she catalogued everything, not emotionally but practically, what had been said, what had been asked, what the room had felt like. The thing she came back to, as she pushed open the stable door and let the warm, hay and animal smell of the place settle around her like something familiar, was Aldrich. Not in any way that alarmed her. Just the specific and unusual quality of his attention. She was accustomed to people listening to her when she spoke about animals and plants. She was not accustomed to people listening to her the way he did, as if what she said was mattering to him in a way that had nothing to do with whether it was useful information. She was not sure what to do with that observation, so she put it down and checked on Gray, whose breathing had improved again, and then Usher, who lifted her head briefly and then settled it back down, and then Storm, who opened one eye when she crouched outside his stall and then closed it again. She lay down on her cot and pulled the blanket up and listened to the sounds of the stable in the dark. She was asleep within minutes. Outside, the stars moved across the sky in the slow, indifferent way they always had. Inside, 6 wolves breathed the steady rhythm of animals that were, slowly and then more surely, getting well. What Mara did not hear, because she was already deeply asleep, was the sound of the stable door opening for just a moment, very late, and then closing again with the same careful quiet it always had when it was him. She would not know about that small thing for a long time. But it had happened, and in the way that small things sometimes do, it mattered. By the 10th day, the mood in the royal stables had changed in a way that was hard to describe precisely but easy to feel. The straw was freshly laid every morning. The water bowls were filled before Mara asked. Oliver had begun arriving earlier, not because anyone told him to, but because the work had started to feel like something worth arriving for. The wolves were the clearest indication of the change. Gray had been walking the length of his stall for 2 days, his steps still careful but his head held at the height it had been before the sickness. Storm had stopped his low warning rumble when the stable hands came to clean and had started watching them with something closer to curiosity than suspicion. Usher had eaten her full portion every day for 5 days and had, that morning, made a soft sound when Mara sat beside her that was not quite a whine but was warmer than silence. 3 were already well enough that Mara had moved them to the larger outdoor enclosure to begin rebuilding the muscle and coordination the fever had taken from them. She watched them from the fence in the early afternoon, the way they tested the ground with each step, the way they moved around each other with the particular language of a pack relearning its own rhythms. She did not notice Aldrich arrive until he was standing at the fence beside her. She had been so focused on the wolves that she had heard him approach and registered it only as background noise. When she became aware of his presence beside her at the fence, she did not startle. She simply looked at him briefly and then looked back at the enclosure. Callum told me 3 of them were outside today, he said. They needed to move. The muscles recover faster with real ground under them. She nodded at the dark-coated wolf nearest the fence. Storm was hesitant this morning. He stayed close to the gate for about an hour. But see him now. Storm was across the enclosure, moving with a loose, exploratory gait, nosing at the corner where the fence met the stone wall. Aldrich watched him for a moment. Then he said, "You know, I have had those wolves for 4 years. I know their names, their moods, which ones eat first and which ones wait. But I did not know the things you described at dinner, the specific way they show discomfort versus distrust versus pain. I thought I knew them well." "You do know them well," Mara said. You know them the way you know people you care about. It is different from knowing them the way a healer knows a patient. Both kinds of knowing matter. He considered that. Do you draw a clear line between the two? Sometimes. Not always. She rested her arms on the top rail of the fence. The afternoon air had a bite to it, the particular cold of late season that smells like the ground getting ready to harden. When I was treating Osha in the first days, she would not let me near the left side of her neck. I knew it was not because the infection had settled there specifically. So I had to figure out if it was pain memory from something old, or distrust of the approach angle, or something else entirely. She paused. It was pain memory. There was a scar under her fur, healed over but still sensitive. Once I understood that, I adjusted how I approached her and the problem resolved. Aldrich had gone still in the way she had noticed he sometimes did when he was paying close attention to something. She was injured before I got her, he said quietly. Several years ago, I would guess, based on the healing. She was very young. Mara kept her voice even. She does not hold it against people. I want to be clear about that. She just has a memory of it, the way all creatures carry memories of harm even after the harm has passed. A pause. Like people, he said. Yes, she said. Like people. They were both quiet for a moment. One of the wolves in the enclosure made a low sound, and all three of them briefly looked toward the far corner before relaxing again. Can I ask you something? Mara said. Yes. The morning you first came to the stables. You came very early. Before the stable hands. Before Oliver. She kept her eyes on the enclosure. How long had you known they were sick before that morning? A bit of silence. 2 weeks. She nodded slowly. She had suspected something like that. The healers told me they had it under control, he said. I trusted that. I also did not want to see them the way they were. He was quiet for a moment. That was a mistake. It is a human thing, she said. To avoid what we are afraid to see clearly. You do not seem to do it. I have had a great deal of practice at not looking away from difficult things, she said it simply, without dramatizing it. My mother taught me that avoiding a hard truth does not make it easier. It just makes you less prepared for it. He was quiet for what felt like a while. Then, she sounds like someone who understood people as well as she understood plants. She understood everything through the same lens, Mara said. She used to say that all living things have the same basic needs underneath the surface differences. Warmth, nourishment, the knowledge that something around them is paying attention. She paused. She applied that to everyone. The plant in the window. The wolf in the yard. The neighbor who had been keeping to herself for too long. And you? She glanced at him. And me. He looked at her directly. Is that why you sleep in the stables? The knowledge that something is paying attention. The question was more precise than she expected. She thought about it honestly. Partly, she said. And partly because I have never been able to stop paying attention myself. It would feel like abandonment to leave them alone in the night when they are this vulnerable. Something moved in his expression. He turned back toward the enclosure. I came to the stables the first morning because Helen told me a village woman had arrived from Aldwick and was sleeping in the straw with the pack, he said. I told myself I was going to ask her to leave. That it was not appropriate to have an unknown person unattended in the stables overnight. Mara said nothing. But then I saw Osha, he said. And I did not ask you to leave. I noticed, she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. But close. They stood at the fence a little longer while the wolves in the enclosure moved through the cold afternoon light, relearning their own strength in the particular patient way of animals that have been very sick and survived it. The sky above the stable yard was the grey-white of a winter afternoon, solid and still. There is a dinner tomorrow evening, Aldrich said finally, not looking at her. Smaller than the last one. Helen and Callum and 1 or 2 others. I would like you to come, if you are willing. I will need to do the evening checks first. Of course. And I will wear the same clothes. This time the sound he made was definitely a laugh. Brief, genuine, and gone quickly, the way things are when a person is not quite used to laughing. That is fine, he said. He left shortly after. Mara stayed at the fence until the cold became too much to ignore, then walked back inside where Gray was waiting with what she had privately decided was a look of mild reproach, as if he felt she had been outdoors long enough. You are not healed enough to have opinions, she told him, but she sat beside him and let him rest his chin on her knee, and she stayed there until the light outside had completely gone. Callum found her there an hour later when he came to relay some message from Helen. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her sitting on the floor with Gray's head in her lap, the lamp burning low, her expression the particular settled calm of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. He delivered his message. He got a clear and practical answer. And then he went back to the palace and told Helen, in a tone that was not gossip but was something close to wonder, that he thought something significant was happening in the stables. Helen, who had known the king for 11 years and had not seen him laugh in the better part of 2 of them, said she was aware. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. It settled on the roof of the stables in a soft and undramatic way, the way that real and lasting things often begin. The conversation about Mara's departure began on a Tuesday. She was not present for it. Helen brought it to Aldrich's attention the way Helen brought most things to his attention, directly and without cushioning it, on a morning when he was reviewing trade correspondence and she could see from his expression that his mind was only half on the letters. She closed the door of the study behind her, sat in the chair across from his desk, and said that the wolves were well, that Mara's work was finished by any reasonable measure, and that the household needed to know whether she was being asked to stay formally or whether she was leaving at the end of the week as she had indicated she would. Aldrich put down the letter he was not reading. Helen waited. What did she say? He asked. When she mentioned the end of the week. She said she had been away from Aldwych for nearly 3 weeks and she should return before the weather made the roads difficult. She was practical about it. She asked Oliver to arrange a cart for Friday morning, Helen paused. She did not seem to be waiting for a reason to stay. Aldrich looked at the window. Outside, the courtyard was blanketed in the snow that had fallen over the past 3 days, and the stables were a dark shape against the white. And if she were offered a former position, he said carefully, what would that look like? Park Healer, Helen said without hesitation. It is not a current role. It has never been a current role because there has never been someone qualified to fill it. But the position exists in the household records from 200 years ago when the park was larger. She folded her hands in her lap. I checked. You checked. I anticipated the question. Aldrich looked at her. Helen's face was perfectly professional. This was one of the things she excelled at. She may not accept it, he said. She may not, Helen agreed. She has her own life in Aldwych. She has reasons to go home. But she also has a reason to consider staying, if someone were to present it to her properly, a pause. And by properly, I mean honestly. Not as a formality or a strategic arrangement, but as what it actually is. Aldrich picked up the letter again. He did not read it. He said, You are overstepping, Helen. Yes, she said pleasantly. I often do. It is why you pay me, she stood. I will tell Oliver to hold the Friday cart until further notice. You have until Thursday to have a conversation. She left before he could respond, which was, he had learned over 11 years, very much her preferred method. Mara was with Usher when Helen appeared at the stable door on Tuesday afternoon. She came in without the hesitation most people showed around the wolves, which Mara had always found she appreciated, and she told Mara there was no rush but the household would like to discuss arrangements for her stay, or her departure, before the end of the week. Mara looked at her. The wolves are stable. 2 more days of observation and I am comfortable saying the treatment is complete. Yes, Helen said. And the question on the table is what happens after that. Mara went back to checking Usher's fur for the skin irritation that sometimes followed a high fever. I had planned to return home on Friday. Oliver was arranging a cart. The cart can be arranged for whenever you need it, Helen paused, and there was something different in the pause, a careful quality. Or it can be not arranged at all. The household is considering whether to formalize a position here. Morrow's hand stilled for a moment. Park Hiller, Helen continued. It is an old row. It would carry a wage and quarters in the East Wing and the expectation that you would be present during the winter months when the park is most vulnerable. Another pause. It is a real offer. It would need to come formally from Aldrich, but I am here to tell you it is coming. Morrow ran her thumb along the edge of Usher's ear. The wolf leaned into the touch slightly. I have a cottage in Aldwych, Morrow said. Yes. And a garden. And a neighbor who watches my plants when I am away but cannot do it indefinitely. Arrangements could be made for your cottage to be maintained during the months you are here. Helen's voice was even. The household has done this kind of thing before. Morrow looked at Usher. Then at Gray's stall, where Gray was watching her with the focused attention he had been giving her since he was well enough to track movement again. Then at Storm, who was lying down but with his head up and his dark eyes open. This is a formal offer from the household, she said. It will be, yes. When Aldrich speaks with you. And when will that be? I imagine, Helen said, when he decides it cannot wait any longer. Morrow looked at her. Which will be when? Helen allowed herself a small smile. I would guess tomorrow. It was tomorrow. It was, to be specific, early morning, before the stable hands arrived, in the way that had become, over the past 2 weeks, simply what the mornings here were. The snow from earlier in the week had stopped, but the ground was still covered, and the cold came through the stable walls in a way that made the lamp warmth feel more precious. Morrow was sitting on her cot drinking the cup of tea she had started making for herself from the herbs Oliver kept in the back, and she was watching Grace sleep, when she heard the door. Aldrich came in and stood in the familiar way, just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust. She poured a second cup of tea from the small pot she had balanced on the edge of the lamp shelf. She held it out in his direction without speaking. He looked at it. Then he crossed the stable and took the cup and sat down on the cot beside her, which was a small and unremarkable thing that also somehow was not either of those. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the sky was starting its slow shift from black to the grey-blue of early morning. The Park Hiller position, he said. Helen came to see me, she said. I know. I asked her to. She wrapped her hands around her cup. It is a real row. It would be. If you take it, he looked at the tea in his hands. The park needs consistent care through the winter. What happened this time should not have happened, and part of why it happened is that there was no one with specific knowledge watching for it. He paused. That is the practical reason. There is also, he said, more quietly, another reason. Morrow waited. You asked me, at the fence, what I meant to do when I came to the stables the first morning. He turned the cup slightly in his hands. I told you I was going to ask you to leave. Yes. I have thought about that a great deal since. He was quiet for a moment. I did not ask you to leave because when I saw you sitting there in the straw with Usher's head in your lap, reading a book in the dark at 5 in the morning, I thought. He stopped. I thought that whatever was happening with you and those wolves was something I did not want to interrupt. She looked at him. And then you told me Usher had eaten broth, he said, and your voice was calm and certain in a way I had not heard anyone's voice be in a long time, and I thought, there it is. That is what I have been missing in this palace for 2 years. He paused. That certainty. That specific, grounded, honest certainty about what matters and how to help it. Morrow did not move. I am not asking you to stay only because the wolves need you, he said. I want to say that clearly. The stable was very quiet. Gray breathed steadily in his stall. Usher's ear twitched once. I know, Morrow said. He looked at her. I have known for a while, she said. I was not sure what to do with it because it is not a simple situation, and I do not do well with things that are not clear. I am not asking for anything complicated, he said. I am asking you to stay. To take the position if you want it, or not to take it and stay some other way. I am asking because these mornings, he stopped again, and she saw something move in his expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen him be in front of other people. These mornings have been the best part of 2 years of otherwise very difficult days. Mara looked at her cup. Then she looked at the wolves. Then she looked at him. My garden will need to be managed, she said. Something in his face shifted. The cottage will need to be kept warm so the pipes do not freeze, she continued. And my neighbor Eleanor has a cat that will wander into the garden if the fence is not maintained, and she always apologizes but she never actually fixes the fence. I will have someone fix the fence, he said. His voice had something in it now that was careful and warm and trying very hard to stay even. I will need my own workspace here. Somewhere I can store supplies and prepare compounds. Not inside the stables, they need their own clean environment, but close. Yes. And I will not wear court clothes. I do not have them and I would not be comfortable in them. Mara, his voice was quiet. She looked at him. Is that a yes? She considered it for one more second, not because she was uncertain, but because she was being honest with herself, going through every practical concern and finding that none of them were reasons to say no, they were details. Things to be managed. The kind of things you manage when the larger answer was already clear and had perhaps been clear for longer than you had officially admitted. Yes, she said. It is a yes. The lamp on the shelf burned steadily. The morning came in slow and quiet through the high stable window. Storm opened his eyes and yawned, a long and dramatic yawn that showed all his teeth and made Mara laugh, a short and real laugh, before she pressed her cup to her lips to settle it. Aldrich looked at Storm, and then he looked at her, and the thing on his face was not complicated. It was simply happiness. The plain, unpracticed kind that appears when a person has not felt it in long enough that they have lost the habit of managing how it looks. Outside, Eleanor's cat was probably already in the garden. Everything else would be figured out. Gray put his head up, looked at both of them with his golden, particular eyes, and then put it back down with the air of an animal who had been quietly aware of what was happening for some time and had decided it was satisfactory. Mara reached over and set her empty cup on the floor. She had work to do. She would always have work to do, and she would do it the same way she had always done it, carefully and honestly and with her full attention. She just had somewhere to do it from now. And that, in the end, was the whole of it.